Welcome to the God Domain, the place on the internet where we put together succinct and in-depth Bible teaching for anyone who wants to go deeper with God. In this short video, we are talking about the deity of Jesus. We're going to put together 3 short arguments that you can use with anyone who asks the question, how does the Bible show that Jesus is God? You'll find in-depth teaching, however, in my book, which tells you how to witness to the sectarian groups, such as the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormons. It's called Witnessing to the Sects, Proving the Deity of Jesus, part of my Biblical Essentials range. And in here you'll find 5 major arguments from the Bible that show Jesus is God, plus many other chapters on smaller arguments and how also to argue against the different sectarian groups, what they teach and how it's all false. But for now we're going to take just 3 short arguments from the book and we're going to show how they work together to prove the deity of Jesus. You know, the quickest way to prove the deity of Jesus is just based upon 2 Bible verses or 2 statements. Jesus, talking to the rich young ruler, says to the rich young ruler, "No one is good except God." It's interesting, isn't it, that Jesus won't let the rich young ruler call him good. That's not to say that Jesus isn't good. It's just that he won't let the rich young ruler call him good, because he says, you don't understand what goodness is. Why do you talk about good? He says to the rich young ruler. Why do you even talk about what's good? No one is good except God. And Jesus makes it really clear that there's only one person who's good, and that's God. That's why it's amazing when a little while later in the Gospels Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd." So on the one hand Jesus says, no one's good except God. And then he says on the other hand, I am the good shepherd. And he calls himself good. He won't let a sinful human being label him that. But he is very clear to call himself good. And let's remind ourselves, Jesus says, only God is good. No one is good except God. So that's the quickest way in which I would normally jump into the scriptures and really begin to go straight in there to actually say, Jesus says, no one is good except God. Then he calls himself the Good Shepherd. However, one of the other quickest ways to prove the deity of Jesus is to prove that he is not created, because everything that is not deity has a beginning. And we're told, in the beginning, God created. Now, therefore, this means that when God starts to create, the beginning begins. We define the beginning when God starts to create. And we know that he creates the heavens and the earth and all the beings that will inhabit the heavenly realms and the earthly realms. However, we understand that the beginning has a beginning. And before that time, there is only God. So when God starts to create something, from that moment onwards, we get the beginning of time and beginning of space. We get the beginning of all created creatures. Anything that is not God has a beginning, and their beginning for a created creature begins after God starts to create. Now, that's why it's really important when we come to John chapter 1, where it says, in the beginning was the Word. Past tense. He already is there. He is before the beginning because he's already there, because he's described in the past tense. The best thing that a Jehovah's Witness has ever said to me on that matter is, well, he said, that's just a tense thing. That's just a tense thing, he said, and then tried to move the conversation on. That is a meaningless phrase. And we know that Jesus says that the very tense in which the Bible is written is inspired, because he proves to the Sadducees the resurrection from the dead by quoting God speaking to Moses saying, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. And from that statement Jesus says he's not the God of the dead but of the living. In other words, I am their God, because even though they're still in the grave, I still am their God today. They're still alive, away from the body, waiting to be resurrected from the dead. And Jesus uses the very tense of the passage in order to communicate doctrinal truth, which shows us the very tense in which the Bible is written is inspired. So when John writes, "In the beginning was the Word," we know that it is part of the proof of the deity of Jesus, that Jesus is not a created creature. Why? Because at the time of the beginning, when God starts to create, he already was. He's already there, which means he's pre-existent. However, one of the strongest arguments you can also put together is based on the phrase "all things." John continues in his gospel by saying, "Through him all things were made." And then he clarifies that and says, "Without him nothing was made that has been made." In other words, he is involved in the creation of all things. Not most things, all things. And that also is a way in which we can prove the deity of Jesus, because he cannot be created if he was involved in the creation of all things, because he could not have been involved in the creation of himself if he were a created creature. But the fact of the matter is, anything that has been made, he was involved in the making of it, because through him all things were made, because God spoke and it came into being. So we know that through him all things were made. Isn't it interesting also that Paul agrees with John? And it's not surprising that Paul agrees with John, because they write by the same Spirit. But in Romans, Paul says, "For from him and through him and to him are all things." And when Paul is talking, he's talking about God. Who was ever given to God that God should repay him? For from him and through him and to him are all things. For from God, Paul says, and through God and to God are all things. And Paul tells us in Romans that it's through God, it's from him, and it's through God, not through an angel, not through a created being, but through God and to God, that all things were made. And John tells us that through him, that is the Word, God the Son, all things were made. So we have in John chapter 1, through him all things. And in Romans, Paul says, through God all things. And we simply have to logically put those passages together, and we know that Jesus therefore is God. Please note as well that in Colossians, the Jehovah's Witnesses add into the passage the word "other" 5 times next to the phrase "all things." So when Paul talks about all things and the Christ creating everything in the book of Colossians, the Jehovah's Witnesses add in the word "other," which does not appear in the original Greek at all, so that it sounds like all other things. And what all other things? All other things that were created other than the Christ, that the Jehovah's Witnesses also want to make it sound as if he was created too. And because they add the word "other" in 5 times, where Paul does not put it in once, they break the 9th commandment, and they are a false witness, providing a false translation that gives the impression that Christ has the option and the ability in that passage to be interpreted as a created creature. The problem the Jehovah's Witnesses have is that they didn't put the word "other" in John chapter 1, and also we have the fact that in Romans all things are made through God. So when we look at the actual passage in Colossians, the passage in Colossians doesn't talk about Jesus being a created creature at all. It also talks about all things. Not were they only made by him and through him, but they are made for him as well. And Paul makes it very clear in Colossians that everything has been made for him. And again in Romans, Paul has reminded us that from him, through him, and to him are all things. In other words, they are to him. They're for him to enjoy, and they're for the Christ to enjoy. So this talk about all things is a wonderful way in which to prove the deity of Jesus. So I hope you've enjoyed this very small video. It's not that long, but we wanted to give you 3 succinct, short arguments to prove the deity of Jesus. There are wonderful ways in which we can do that. You'll find them on the course, where we will go into far greater depth online, or as I say, you can buy my Witnessing to the Sectarian Groups book, which you can purchase from Amazon, and that again will also give you all of these arguments in great depth. Well, thanks for watching our video. If you wish to donate to the website, then there is a donate button at the bottom of the front page. And please remember, if you've really enjoyed these teaching materials, to tell other people about us, and also to share links to us online via social media, whether that's a link to the main website page, or whether you wish to share one of our freebie videos where you can embed the code into a Twitter or Facebook post.